Without a doubt, Christian apologists are wrong. I can't emphasize this enough. And it's not just Christian apologists. There is this apologetic, even within scholarship, that keeps going, that Jesus' birth, that virgin birth by Mary, where the pneuma overshadows her and she has Jesus, is unique. And there are no other non-sexual union birth conceptions where the God conceives a child through a mortal woman without sex, other than Jesus. This is not true. Share this with anyone who denies it, because the evidence, they just haven't seen it yet. But Dr. M. David Litwa, he has dug deep into this. Every serious academic that I speak to goes, his work is mind-blowing. Be sure to go check out his stuff, go in the description, share this with the next fundamentalist or atheist that says otherwise. Ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about divine births. Maybe some of these might be virgins, or we're going to address this issue today with Dr. M. David Litwa. He's got a YouTube channel. He's got a Patreon. Go down in the description now. Maybe your children will be conceived of a God if you do so. Go help him out. Dr. Litwa, welcome back to MythVision.
Hi, Derek. Yeah, great to be here. Happy holidays to you and everybody. It's good to be back.
I'm really thankful you're back. You're going to be able to educate us today and diving into my favorite book that you produced. And it's up there. Like, it competes with, The Evil Creator and some other stuff that I really enjoy. Just understanding Jesus in a Mediterranean world. Jesus Deus, it's got a lot of praise among many other scholars as well.
Today I'll be looking at whether you need to have sex between divine beings and human women in order to produce a divine conception. Because today, when people think of this on a popular level, they kind of have these binary categories set for them. So if they know a little bit about Greek mythology, they kind of imagine that Zeus and Apollo were really, really horny back in the day, and they would repeatedly have sex with human women, and that would produce the race of demigods, and who are the heroes of Hesiod's age of heroes. And that's how we got Heracles and Romulus, and Asclepius and so many others. It's that you had a sex act between God and a mortal woman, although sometimes it could be the reverse, of course. Aphrodite having sex with whoever she wanted to. I mean, she had her own escapades as well. So there's this idea that that's sort of what the Greek religion was about in the time of Jesus. And then the Jewish religion, where God was, or Yahweh, was basically an asexual being. And he didn't hang around women, and he didn't even like women, didn't even allow menstruating women to go into the temple. And he was really kind of prudish, and he never, the Jews just didn't imagine their deity having sex or being involved with sex and sexual activity. So it was a completely different worldview. Now, all this entire binary is based on an apologetic framework. And this is really what I want to emphasize here, folks, that this is exactly the argument that Justin Martyr made around the year 150 in trying to argue for the truth of Christianity. And this very contingent apologetic argument has unfortunately has become so hackneyed and repeated so much that it has passed for historical fact. And that's just not the case. And it's really important to see that our job as thinking people and as historians or budding historians is not simply to repeat the apologetic arguments of ancient Christians as if they were fact, okay? because and to not let one particular religion or insider discourse control the terms and the framework of thinking, but to step outside of the box, start afresh, and think anew. Okay, I know many of you may have taken a course in classical mythology, or you may have a book in classical mythology, and think that this is all very obvious. But in the time of Jesus, these Greeks and Romans were as sophisticated as you or me in how they thought about divine conception. And for different reasons, okay, they had issues with gods having sex. Okay. Now, again, if you're reading Homer, Homer is archaic age. Okay. So doesn't seem to have a problem with gods having sex at all. Okay. Agreed. But the New Testament wasn't written when Homer or whoever was writing. It wasn't written when Hesiod was writing. It was written 600 years after that, after the development of some of the most complex philosophies and scientific arguments this world has ever seen. Okay? The New Testament is post-Plato. And with Plato, he revolutionizes everything. Typically elite, educated, and intellectual Greeks of the time of Jesus and of the time of the New Testament writers, which is the late 1st and early 2nd century, they do not believe, literally, that gods have sex with mortals, because that's just not what gods do.
Okay, and if I may, just to poke in here, this is great because I asked a question. I'm giving people behind a paywall a little sneak peek. A recent course was done on other virgin births, supposed other virgin births. And Dr. Bart Ehrman, who was your professor at one point, took the stance that, these gods, they had sex, or in some way they end up impregnating these women. Like even the interpretation, let's say in Suetonius, which I think we might mention with Augustus, and there's a serpent there that is at the in the bed with his mother, with Augustus' mother. I can't remember her name, but she ends up going and like bathing, and then 9 months later, there you have the baby, and therefore this is somehow a sexual union. But I asked him a question, particularly in what you said, and I said, have there been any other gods who have impregnated women through the pneuma? And I use that specific term, and he knew that was a catchy term. He even emphasized it when he was saying it. He said no. And I'm not trying to be pitting scholars against each other, but sometimes I'll catch Dr. Ehrman where I'll say, hey, do you date Luke in the 2nd century? And he's like, 85. And I'm like, hold on, Steve Mason, Litwa, Shelley Matthews, like all of these scholars are late, definitely late 1st or at least early 2nd, maybe even the mid 2nd. He's still on the 85 AD. So we want to give him a little credit here, but it sounds like he's kind of holding on to maybe some dated ideas.
Yep. Well, yep. He's very traditional in some respects, despite his reputation. Yep. It is true that historians, even around the time of the late 1st century, like Plutarch, is a great example. He will tell you the story of how Alexander the Great was conceived by means, supposedly, of a gigantic snake appearing in the bed of Alexander's mother, Olympias. But Plutarch will also tell you in his Life of Alexandria that he doesn't believe that story. And he doesn't believe that story because that's just not what gods do. And ever since the days of Plato, there were certain rules of theology. And this is in Plato's Republic. Plato's first rule of theology is a god does not lie, and a god, second, which is more of an expanded version of the first, a god does not change. And it's these two rules of theology that revolutionized all later theology, including Christian theology. It was not acceptable for a God to lie or be involved in a lying action, that is, to take on the body and pretend to be someone else. For instance, in the story of Heracles' birth, Zeus takes on the body of Heracles' human father, Amphitryon. Plato says, no, he didn't. Or if he did, that's not Zeus, right? Because that's not what gods do. Gods do not deceive and they do not change. And why is it that gods do not change? It's because gods are already perfect. Gods do not need anything. They are not deficient in any respect. Sex is the expression of human needs. I'm well aware that, there are some asexual people. Okay, that's totally fine. But for a large proportion of humanity, sex is a biological need. It's hormone driven, and and because it's a need, okay, it's an expression of our own deficiency, right? We're not complete without a partner, without a sexual partner. We don't live the full flourishing life. We are incomplete without that. That is a manifestation of human weakness. Gods do not have that. Gods are not deficient, and then they do not change, and they don't have hormonal fluctuations, and they do not get horny, right? So this is Plato, okay? Sex involves the greatest amount of changes emotionally and bodily, and that is unacceptable according to the Platonic rules of theology. And anyone who is intellectual in the Roman period knows this. Okay, so yes, historians can still, tell, like Suetonius, these mythological tales, but do they, in their mode as philosophers, actually believe that, first of all, women have sex with snakes in temples or wherever? No. And this is a case where we ask that great question, did the Greeks believe in their myths? Well, yes and no. They wanted to protect their sacred cultural lore, but just like Christians today, they reinterpret it so that it's updated to fit the scientific and moral standards of the time. So they do not believe that gods have sex. And the key example of this is Plutarch in talking about the divine conception of Plato. Okay, Plato is, or was, a human being, and he did not need to have, or his mother did not have sex with any god in order to produce Plato. His mother was Perictione, and it was very early tradition put out by Plato's own nephew shortly after he died. So we're talking about the mid-4th century, so 450 years before Jesus. There was a tradition that Plato was the offspring of Apollo. And during the time when the author of Luke was writing, which is, I think, in the first edition, the very late 1st century, you had Plutarch, who's writing at exactly the same time, telling us how he thinks that Plato was born from Apollo, because he wants to save the myth, right? It's his myth. He wants to save the fact that Plato is divinely conceived. But he cannot accept, as an intellectual and as a thinker of his time, late 1st, early 2nd century, that that's how gods operate. So in his table talk and in his Life of Pneuma, he presents a theory that there is no vaginal penetration of Perictione by Apollo. That wouldn't be how Apollo works. There is a more subtle way of conceiving. And, the Greeks weren't stupid. They observed things, and they observed what they thought were they weren't divine conceptions, but what they called wind eggs. And wind eggs were eggs that produced chicks without any male rooster being involved. And they get the name wind eggs, which sounds rather simple or silly, but basically the way that the Greeks thought that this happened was that these eggs were fertilized by pneuma, which is wind. But in the New Testament, it's also translated spirit. It also means breath. It's hot air that you breathe out. And it's very subtle. And according to Aristotle, it is that thing which is in male semen, which fertilizes the female egg inside the womb. So pneuma is the natural choice, based on the scientific literature of the day, to talk about how a woman gets pregnant. And if a god is going to impregnate a woman, he need not, in fact, morally, he cannot impersonate a man with a penis. That's unnecessary. And gods wouldn't be involved in that. They have no interest in that. They have no need for that. That's not what gods do. But it's still possible for them to breathe, right? And they breathe in an efflux of their own divine seed, and it enters the woman's body and makes her pregnant. To illustrate how concretely Christians thought about this, there's the later Christian tradition that Mary conceived through her ear, which means that divine pneuma entered through an orifice, because it has to go through somewhere. And so the theory was that it went through Mary's ear. Why her ear? Well, because she was so obedient. And if you look at the root of obedience, it's from audio, ab audio, and audio has to do with hearing. Hence the ear. She is so obedient, she receives the Spirit through the ear. And that is what makes her pregnant, because the pneuma has to travel through her ear down to the uterus. That's how concretely they thought about this. This wasn't some magical event. They actually did think about, the actual connection of cause and effect. Okay, they didn't think that God snapped his fingers and all of a sudden Mary was pregnant. No, you needed some biological material agent, and the natural solution was pneuma. So this is what Plutarch says, that Perictione, Plato's mother, gave birth through another kind of divine power, which is dynamis, and pneuma. And I have the text cited in chapter 1 of Jesus Deus. I've also got on my YouTube channel an episode on chapter 1. So you can check out the footnotes there and read up on Plutarch. What's interesting is when you look up Luke 135, we have in the Greek the exact same words used by Plutarch in reference to the pregnancy of Plato, used now for the pregnancy, for the divine conception of Jesus. Luke says in the Greek, and I'll translate, pneuma hagion epeleusita epise, which means a holy breath, as I like to say, a holy breath will come upon you. This is the angel speaking to Mary for how she gets pregnant. Cadinimus ipsistu episciasisi, and power of a Most High will overshadow you. So he uses those exact same two terms that Plutarch uses in the exact similar context when talking about how a god impregnates a woman. Pneuma and dynamis. And so what this shows us is that the author of Luke is probably at least trying to sound as sophisticated as Plutarch, who is our representative Greek intellectual of the late 1st and early 2nd century. Okay. And Luke, whoever Luke is, I'm just using that as a placeholder. The author of Luke, let's say, knows that if he were to tell a story about, God impregnating Mary by taking on, the form of Joseph, well, that's not going to fly. Okay. That's not going to work. I mean, no Greek intellectual would touch that stuff. Okay. But if there was a more subtle theory of divine conception, which involved these quasi-scientific terms, pneuma and dynamis, well, then we're talking. That's the point where the author of Luke tries to get a foothold into the structures of plausibility for the Greek intellectuals of this time. Because he's already an apologist, okay? He already knows that no one is going to believe a story of God having sex with a mortal woman. Okay, he's looking over his shoulder at people like Plutarch who would sneer at that kind of thing. So he's smart enough to say that this divine conception happened through the mechanics of pneuma and dynamis, just as Plato's own divine conception happened. So it ends up that both Plutarch and the author of Luke can have their cake and eat it too, right? Because Plutarch can say, yes, I revere Plato. I call Plato Theos Platon, the divine Plato. Why do I do that? Because he is the true son of Apollo. He can still affirm that, right? And Apollo is the god of music and the god of harmony. So yes, those are Plato's characteristics. And the author of Luke can say, guess what? Jesus is the true son of a god, in this case, Yahweh. And Yahweh doesn't need to get his hands dirty. And Yahweh doesn't need a penis to do any of these things. Yahweh can act just like Plutarch's Apollo and send his own breath to impregnate Mary. So this completes Luke 135, just to translate it. So the Greek is Dioketa genomenon hagian klithesita huios theou. And because of this, the divine mechanics of non-sexual conception, what is born will be called sacred, a son of a god. That's the literal translation of the Greek. And this shows once and for all that for intellectuals, at least, and the author of Luke is trying to pose as an intellectual, you don't need to have sexual intercourse to produce a divine conception. Greeks don't need it, and Christians don't need it. So yes, even though it's true that in Homer, gods have sex, and in historians, gods have sex, apparently, by the time of the late 1st and early 2nd century, they aren't believing it. We're long beyond the age when Yahweh had a wife. I mean, he did have a wife at some point. But the Jews had ceased to believe that for maybe half a millennium before Christianity came on the scene. So when you're looking at the development of religions, and we were to take a time machine and go back to the 8th century BC, and if we had archaic Hebrew, we would ask, does Yahweh have a wife, and can he have kids? Can he have sex? Because El gives birth to Baal, right? the Phoenicians say that. So does Yahweh give birth to somebody, or does somebody give birth to Yahweh? And I think they'd say, well, yeah, because Yahweh's got a wife, just like Baal has a wife. I mean, this is not a problem, right? Theologically, it's not a problem. But then you fast forward 500 years, and all of a sudden it becomes a big problem for different reasons. But both Jews and Greeks and Jews who were also Christians were becoming sophisticated enough by the era of the New Testament to say that, no, we don't have gods who have sex. We have divine conception, but there's nothing to do with, penetration. So this shows everyone that Justin's argument in the first apology, again, written around 150, is somewhat double dealing, let's say, and not entirely accurate. Because what Justin says is that Greeks and Romans, they really do believe that, Zeus dresses up as somebody else and has sex with a mortal woman, whereas the Christians, they're too good to believe that. Well, Plutarch shows that argument falls flat. Greeks and Romans who are sophisticated intellectually do not believe that, did not believe that, and neither did the Christians. They're exactly equal. And so we need to lay down forever that apologetic framework and argument.
There's so many things here, Dr. Litwa. You said some great stuff. So I have a question. We'll start like a few questions at a time as we go into this, because I'm sure you'll have plenty to cover. Are there any examples that could be given about gods having sex with women after Plato? Is the tradition, is there like a dual tradition, or would you say, like you said, it's pretty much stamped out, at least you'd say within the first few generations after Plato? Would you say it's completely stamped out?
No, it's not stamped out. No, not at all, because it's intellectuals who are pushing this line. And, other writers don't care too much about it. And it's also a question of genre, in the historical genre, like what Suetonius is writing, in that genre, he can say, oh yeah, I mean, there's this story that, Augustus's mother was in a temple at night and had sex with a snake, and there you go. He's just reporting a story, right? He's not telling you that he believes it. If he was in private conversation with Tacitus, he'd be like, this is garbage, but I'm going to report it because this will sell books. So, this is exactly how they're thinking. And then when Plutarch you can see this dynamic in Plutarch. Plutarch writes a biography of Alexander in which he's under obligation to tell you the common story that his mother had sex with a snake. Okay. But he then says, this is the story. He's like Herodotus. He says, this is the story. I have no part in this. But then when he's in the scientific mode and in the scientific treatise, speaking simply as a philosopher, not as a biographer, he will say, no, we don't believe this. No intellectual would believe this. We uphold the tradition that Plato is born of Apollo, yes, but we do not believe that Apollo had sex with a mortal woman. That's just not true.
So at least this grants us that the author of the gospel we call Luke is within the elite kind of, maybe the elite isn't the term, but the highly sophisticated thinkers. Because I don't want to give the idea that necessarily they're rich. I mean, there's some poor people who become sophisticated philosophers later on, high intellectuals. So they're highly intellectual. Can we grant Matthew in the same category?
Well, so the way I would put it is these authors are trying to sound like they're elite intellectuals. Whether we want to call them elite intellectuals is another story. But they know at least the modes and codes of how to be most plausible. Right. And so, yes, the author of Luke is of the highest register. He's the one coming closest to Plutarch. Matthew shows a lot less concern. Matthew's not as interested in the actual mechanics of the divine conception. I think Matthew would deny that, obviously God had sex, and I think other readers of Matthew, that would be, Greek readers contemporary with Matthew, they would not be cool with that either. But I don't think Matthew's interested in the mechanics of the sex, and he's happy to tell what is essentially Christian mythology, and just kind of let that sit with you. So he's got, the escape to Egypt and the massacre of the children probably never happened. All these angels appearing in dreams. I mean, Greek historians who were trying to go up to the level of Thucydides would be like, no, this is trash literature. This is not good enough. This doesn't come up to snuff. But if you're just of the standard of Herodotus, right? Because Herodotus is the father of history, and he tells, more myths than Matthew. So, but Herodotus always says, I'm just reporting this, folks. I don't actually believe this, but I'm going to tell you the story. And Matthew's not that sophisticated. He tells the story as if he believes it. And he probably does. So he's not quite at the author of Luke's level. And I don't think either of them are at the level of Thucydides or of Tacitus. But they're pushing upward. They're going upward, and they're trying to sound plausible as they can.
So it is fair to say, when we hear, and I'm using anti-apologetics here for a second, which I know you don't care to get into the mix, but it is an interesting question. Christian apologists will go around and say, this is unique. In fact, Bart Ehrman himself at least grants that in this case, Jesus being born through a non-sexual union of a virgin at that, which we haven't got to the question of virgin yet, is wholly unique, and we got to give that to Christianity. And where I would agree with Bart and go, at least every single one of these myths is unique in a sense. Every one of them. If you go to Zeus, you go to Hercules, you go to Plato, they all have different narratives, different gods, different stories about maybe how things go. So if you want to be literal, sure, they're unique. But to argue that this one isn't within a zeitgeist of thought, that it's somehow completely unique, as Christian apologists do, that would be a false statement. Would you agree? Or at least a mistaken statement?
Yeah, you haven't read widely enough, or you've just read in one genre. You've just read in the Historia genre rather than the genre of scientific literature. So yeah, you pick up Plutarch's Table Talk, or you pick up Aristotle's discussion of how you can have hens giving birth to chicks without roosters, and they're talking on a different register and a different level, and they're happy to talk about things as intellectuals, not just reporting the common story. But even so, the case of Apollonius of Tyana is an interesting one, and I'll just say a little bit about this while I have time. So I think Bart and I differ on reading the Apollonius of Tyana, because this is 3rd century. Okay, so it's post-Christian. It's Philostratus, and Philostratus tells the story about how Apollonius's mother gave birth, and it's quite a funny story, I think, but he says, and I'm not including all the details, but he says that basically his mother fell asleep in a field of flowers, sort of like Persephone, and that she was surrounded by these birds, basically. I think he calls them geese, but I'll have to check that. And that in unison, these birds lift their wings and then beat them. And at that moment, his mother wakes up and she's pregnant. So what are the assumptions of that story? Well, I think this is another instance of a non-sexual conception. What happens when birds beat their wings? Moving air, pneuma. That's how the Greeks thought of it. Pneuma is moving air, moving warm gust of air. Enters the woman, that's how she gets pregnant. The mechanics are the same, right? It's pneuma. And who gets those birds together? Who fertilizes the wind? Well, in this case, it's Proteus, the god Proteus, because Proteus is the real father of Apollonius. So here's another case of a non-sexual birth, but it appears in a history, and in my book, How the Gospels Became History, I explain, that there's a difference between ancient historia and modern history, but we're talking about ancient historia. This appears in a book of ancient historia. It looks like a mythical tale. Greeks would call it a mythical tale, but it's still based on the presuppositions of the day of how a woman could give birth non-sexually. It would happen through pneuma.
Wow. Okay. This is great. Now, question is, are there any virgins? And I asked this of Dr. Ehrman, and I even went so far as to say, does it even matter? I mean, at the end of the day, it's the conception of the deity to having the child. I mean, through a mortal woman. Is virginity a valuable thing in the world at this time? Or is that a later anachronistic kind of development, as we see eventually? Mary couldn't even have had sex with Joseph. We have to have her be a perpetual virgin. And these ideas start to kind of develop over time. I'm not sure how much time, but virginity. Can you touch this topic?
Yeah, definitely. I don't have a lot of time, but I'll try to give you as much background as I can. So if you're, and this will take us all the way back to Leviticus, okay? And Leviticus is, everyone's favorite nighttime reading, and I'm sure all of your viewers read this every day. But there's all these rules about menstruating women, and they can't go into the temple. And so there's something polluting about sex and childbirth that goes back way back. And then you have to ask, well, are the Greeks and the Jews, are they different on this? Well, no, they're actually not, because if you go to the Greek ritual law codes, they also say that, women who are menstruating or who after childbirth, they have to wait 30 or 40 days before coming into the temple with the presence of the god. And if you've just had sex last night, please don't go to the temple. Okay, so you have to wait a day at least. You have to abstain from sex a day at least. And if you're really serious, like in the religion of Isis, right? You're reading Apuleius and the Metamorphoses. He can't appear before Isis unless he's abstained from sex and meat for at least 10 days. So the gods, both Jewish gods and Greek gods, they do care about sex and impurity and blood and childbirth, and they don't like that stuff. And they haven't liked that stuff for thousands of years. So there's a discourse of impurity when you're talking about sex. Sex is ritually defiling. Okay, and Greeks and Jews are hold that presupposition. Okay, long before Plato did. Now Plato, adds an extra reason why gods don't have sex and why they don't like sex. He tries to rationalize it and says, well, they don't lie and they don't change. So rationally, we figured this out. But when you're just talking on the level of impurity, then yes, there's something very, very primitive about this idea that sex is something that would make you impure. Therefore, a god wouldn't be involved in that activity, and it would be defiling for a god to have sex with a mortal woman, and it would also be defiling if a son of God was born from a mortal who had sex with a man. That's just not how it works. So if you're going to have a true divine conception, then yes, you need to get over this. You need to have a virgin which is just to say a woman who is pure, so that she gives birth to a pure child. And that's exactly the language that Luke, or the author of Luke, uses, hagion. He says, and because of these divine mechanics, the child will be called hagion, which means sacred. And why sacred? Because it's pure. So he's involved in purity ideologies. And the best book that I can recommend for people interested in ideologies of purity and impurity is Mary Douglas, called Purity and Danger. I think that's the title anyway. We can correct that later. But this book basically is an interpretation of Leviticus and shows you, why ancient people were so concerned about purity. Purity is different than cleanliness, right? It's related, they overlap, but it's different. And with a god, if you're going to have any interaction with a god, you need to be pure. So that's why the virgin birth becomes both a ritual and a rational necessity by the time of the author of Luke.
Wow. Okay, that makes a lot of sense, of a lot of information. It is Christmas time, and a lot of people right now are celebrating Christmas. They're looking at, this is the time which Jesus was born. And I figured this would be like a perfect episode to give people who want to go deeper than maybe a surface level examination on the topic. Of course, your book, Jesus Deus, goes deeper. Are you, is there anything in particular on your Patreon that you're doing that might actually take people further, that should join up, or anything else, maybe other classes, ideas, topics, things like that you have exclusive over there?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I have an article on divine births on the Patreon. Patrons get book deals with me, and I teach Greek over the Patreon for those getting introduced to Greek, who just want to deal with a little bit of Greek to eventually, free themselves from English translations or mistranslations that are which are so frequent. And so, I hope that, I can provide a service to anyone who wants to join and to get a little deeper, and just get out of these apologetic frameworks, which unfortunately, even scholars get trapped in, and it's like quicksand. You're trained to think in a certain way, and you never really get out of it. But we want to use the hammer and break the apologetical framework so that we can think outside the box.
I not only have found that the method you're describing here and what you're teaching more freeing from the apologetics world, of course, but also it has allowed me to view a lot of this stuff more artistically and actually value it as a human. Like divorce it from the dogma and the stigma that comes with it, and see it and go, wow, that's clever. That's an interesting story. How humans thought about that. I thought about how pine trees and pollen, passes in the wind and how it pollinates other trees. And I thought about that with the pneuma of, God. It just made me think, nature itself is a gift to humans. And we have tried to interpret the world through these natural observations, and then, put it into this category of the gods and stuff. So they might be more sophisticated than we give them credit for.
Definitely. And, in the end, everyone will have to decide on what myths they hold to be true. But I think you get to the point where you enjoy the myth as the myth, and then that frees you to think about deeper levels of truth. We all eventually, I think, we come back to our tradition and we think through how we may or may not be able to believe it. And that should be a joyful journey. It shouldn't be a stressful one where we're worried about being, poked with a pitchfork by screaming devils, in the afterlife. Life should be so much more enjoyable than worrying about that.
I agree. Are you working on any book right now? Before I let you go, is there any book that's coming out sometime in the next year or so?
Well, I'm working on 3 books, and I am not sure if any of them will come out. I'm hoping that I have a book on Alexandria, earliest Christianity in Alexandria, which is a revisionist history of that earliest place where we see early Christian diversity and the birth of Christian theology in a way that isn't like the Roman form, which people are so used to. And, we'll be looking at people like Philo and Apollos and Barnabas, Basilides, Carpocrates, Prodicus, Eugnostus, Julius Cassianus, Valentinians, Apelles, and the Nicene preacher. And I'll be expanding my reflection on the Nicenes in a complete book, which I hope to make accessible to a popular audience. And then I'm also seeing if I can finish up a book on Simon of Samaria. So there's a lot coming down the pike, very happy to help anyone in their journey as they wade through some of this material, some of this both hidden and unfortunately, unknown, inaccessible material.
Thank you so much, Dr. Litwa. Until next time.
Sure thing. Happy holidays.
You as well.